before Hannibal Lecter became a cultural icon, before the fava beans, the Chianti, the mask, there was a book that quietly redefined what psychological crime fiction could do. Published in 1981, Red Dragon was Thomas Harris's third novel, and it introduced the world to one of literature's most terrifying intellects. But here's what routinely gets overlooked. Hannibal Lecter is not the monster at the center of the story. He is, in many ways, the most controlled character in it. The real nightmare belongs to Francis Dollarhyde, a man who has reimagined himself as something ancient and terrible, and who is coming apart at the seams. This is a deep dive into Red Dragon, its architecture, its twists, its psychology, and why, more than 4 decades after publication, it remains one of the most clinically precise thrillers ever written. Harris opens with a masterstroke of economy. Will Graham, a retired FBI profiler, the best who ever lived, though he would argue the point, is persuaded back into active duty to hunt a serial killer the press has dubbed the Tooth Fairy. 2 families have been murdered in their homes 1 month apart during the full moon. The inciting incident is tight, and the stakes are immediate. There are roughly 30 days before the next full moon, and the Tooth Fairy will kill again. That is the ticking clock. It doesn't need to be metaphorical. It is literal. What Harris does with pacing is arguably his greatest technical achievement in this novel. He runs 2 parallel narrative engines simultaneously. The first follows Graham, his investigation, his consultations, his slow deterioration. The second follows Dollarhyde, the killer himself, in close third person. This is where Harris's structural audacity pays off most completely. By the time the reader understands who the Tooth Fairy is, Harris has already put us inside his skull. We know his origin, his compulsion, his self-mythology. We are watching a man convinced he is undergoing a divine transformation, and we understand, with uncomfortable clarity, how he arrived at that conviction. Chapter lengths are deliberately manipulated. Short, punchy chapters accelerate the clock. Harris cuts between Graham's grim profiling work and Dollarhyde's ritualistic preparation in rapid succession, producing a cross-cutting effect that is more cinematic than literary. The result is claustrophobic urgency. Every scene you spend with Graham, you are aware that somewhere Dollarhyde is moving. The cliffhanger mechanics are restrained but surgical. Harris rarely ends chapters on cheap shock. Instead, he ends them on realizations. The moment a character understands something the reader has been dreading, they would understand. That is a more sophisticated form of tension than a door creaking open. It is the horror of comprehension, not surprise. Red Dragon operates less on a single seismic twist and more on a sustained architecture of revelation, which makes its pivotal turns more credible and more devastating than any single act of narrative sleight of hand. The first major structural reveal is that Hannibal Lecter, incarcerated in a maximum security asylum, is actively working against Graham, feeding Dollarhyde information about the profiler's whereabouts via a coded message published in the tabloid. This is not a deus ex machina. Harris plants it with cold precision. Lecter's intelligence and his pathological contempt for Graham, the man who caught him, is established early. The revelation that he is weaponizing that intelligence from inside a cage is not a shock. It is an inevitable consequence of the kind of predator Lecter is. He doesn't need to be free to cause damage. That is the point. The second major turn involves Dollarhyde's relationship with Reva McClane, a blind woman who works at the same film processing lab as the killer. This is Harris at his most unsettling. The relationship is not a red herring. It is a genuine rupture in Dollarhyde's pathology. He is capable, in some fractured corner of himself, of human attachment. Harris does not use this to redeem him. He uses it to deepen the horror. Because when the dragon reasserts dominance and the relationship becomes a source of threat rather than comfort, the violence that follows is not the violence of a cartoon monster. It is the violence of a man tearing himself in half. Harris plants clues throughout with restraint rather than abundance. The details of the crime scenes, the positioning of mirrors, the specific nature of the victims, the full moon timing, accumulate into a profile the reader assembles alongside Graham. Nothing is withheld unfairly. The horror is not that the killer is someone we couldn't have suspected. The horror is that we understand exactly why he is what he is. Will Graham is one of the most psychologically complex protagonists in crime fiction, and Harris spends almost no time congratulating him for it. Graham's gift, his ability to inhabit the perspective of killers with precision, is framed not as heroism but as damage. He caught Lecter because he could think like Lecter. That process left marks that have not healed. His wife Molly and his stepson represent his attempt at an ordinary life, and Harris makes it clear that Graham knows how fragile that attempt is. He does not want to go back into the field. He goes back anyway. That tension between self-preservation and professional compulsion drives every scene he occupies. Graham is not an unreliable narrator in the technical sense. Harris gives him a clarity of perception that is almost forensic. But he is an unreliable judge of himself. He insists he is not like the killers he profiles. The novel's most uncomfortable implication, never stated outright, never sentimentalized, is that the difference may be narrower than Graham will admit. Dollarhyde is the novel's true psychological achievement. Harris constructs his pathology with the rigor of a case study: an abandoned child, a grotesque, untreated cleft palate, a grandmother who by any clinical standard was abusive. Harris traces the formation of a monster with precision and without pity. Dollarhyde has created an alternative identity he calls the Great Red Dragon, drawn from the William Blake painting of the same name. He is in the process of becoming, or believes himself to be, this creature. The delusion is total. His crimes are not expressions of rage. They are acts of religious devotion. What makes Dollarhyde genuinely frightening is that Harris never makes him stupid. He is careful, methodical, and intelligent. He holds down a skilled job, maintains a house, passes unnoticed. The dragon exists alongside this ordinary life, not instead of it. That coexistence is the source of the novel's deepest and most lasting dread. Hannibal Lecter appears in relatively few scenes. He is imprisoned for the entirety of the novel and takes no direct physical action. His power is entirely psychological and informational. He is the one character in the book who operates without internal conflict, who knows exactly what he wants and exactly why. In a novel populated by fractured psyches and broken self-knowledge, his absolute clarity is its own form of menace. Harris sets his investigation across institutional America, FBI facilities, film processing plants, and suburban homes that look exactly like the homes of the victims. The mundane geography is entirely deliberate. There is no Gothic castle here, no fog-drenched moor. The horror lives in ordinary places: a well-lit workplace, a backyard at dusk, a family home in the middle of a quiet night. This is perhaps Harris's most significant contribution to the genre. He strips away the romantic distance that allows readers to feel safely removed from fictional violence. The asylum housing Lecter, the Baltimore State Hospital for the criminally insane, is rendered with particular cold attention. The physical layout, the plexiglass barrier, the rigid protocol of every visit all contribute to a setting that conveys both absolute security and absolute unease. Lecter is contained, and yet every scene inside that building feels dangerous. Harris achieves this through attention to Lecter's effect, his stillness, his elaborate courtesy, the measured and assessing quality of his attention. The physical environment says imprisoned. Everything else says something quite different. The full moon timeline functions as a second layer of environmental pressure. Nature itself becomes complicit in the novel's urgency. Time does not pass neutrally here. Every chapter brings the next full moon closer, and Harris ensures the reader never forgets it. His prose is precise without being cold. He writes action with economy and human psychology, with the detached authority of someone who has spent too long reading case files and found them more illuminating than most fiction. The result is a narrative voice that feels forensic but not unfeeling. Dread is built not through overwrought description, but through the accumulation of specific, observed detail. A detail that seems procedural in Chapter 3 becomes unbearable by Chapter 15. That delayed detonation is the architecture of sustained tension. Red Dragon is, at its core, a novel about the cost of perception. The ability to understand another human being with accuracy, to model their psychology, to see the world as they see it, is presented not as a superpower, but as a form of slow contamination. Graham understands killers because he can think like killers. The novel asks and never fully answers whether that capacity represents a clinical skill or a shared pathology. This theme runs through every layer of the story. Dollarhyde believes he is becoming something transcendent, that his crimes constitute transformation rather than destruction. Graham believes he is preventing something monstrous, but prevention requires him to entertain monstrous thoughts with genuine fluency. Harris does not editorialize. He presents both men as the products of their formation and leaves the reader to calculate the distance between them. That calculation is the work of the book. The second major theme is the mythology of self-creation. Dollarhyde has looked at his life, the abandonment, the physical ridicule, the casual cruelties of childhood, and constructed an alternative identity capable of terror and power. This is not presented sympathetically. Harris is not asking for pity, but he is asking for understanding of the mechanism. The dragon is not imported evil, it is assembled from damage. The resolution is earned but unromantic. Graham survives, though the word feels too clean. He is physically disfigured by the encounter and psychologically dismantled by the case in ways that the novel tracks without flinching. Dollarhyde is stopped not through pure investigative triumph, but through a chain of events involving his own fractured relationship with Reba. The victory, such as it is, arrives at significant cost. Harris refuses catharsis. There is no triumphant closure, no sense that the world has been made right. There is only the end of this particular sequence of violence, and Graham retreating once more to his family, a little further from intact. What Harris leaves deliberately unresolved is the question of whether Graham can continue to exist the way he has been existing, permanently suspended between the ordinary life he wants and the dark utility that makes him indispensable. The final pages suggest a man who has survived but not escaped. That distinction is the whole novel. Red Dragon is not a thriller that wants to entertain you. It wants to disturb you in ways that take days to fully register. Harris wrote a book about violence that refuses to aestheticize it, about a genius villain deliberately kept off center stage, and about a hero whose heroism is inseparable from his damage. It introduced a literary universe that would grow to include The Silence of the Lambs and beyond. But in this first installment, before the mythology solidified, there was a rawness to the material. The sequels never quite recaptured. The notoriety of Hannibal Lecter has, in some ways, obscured what Red Dragon actually is. A methodical, serious, and genuinely frightening study of how violence forms, how it thinks, and what it costs the people whose job it is to understand it. 45 years on, it has not dated. It has only grown more precise.